All right, so welcome back, everybody. We are going to take a look at Chapter 4 today, which introduces the topic of models and metaphors. And the basic idea here is that when you go into a career of any type, you don't just kind of walk into it and do whatever you want to do. Instead, there's usually someone there that's got a training session for you. You're taught to do things in a particular way. Now, in some instances, there are a lot of different ways in which things are done, and it's simply a matter of figuring out, who is doing it in what way. You look at other careers, and you'll find that, well, maybe there's only one way that things are done. But the point is that whether there's multiple ways and you have to pick the one that's best for you, or whether there's only one way, you don't just kind of go in and do whatever. You have to kind of walk into it expecting that there's going to be certain rules that you have to follow. And that's what this chapter deals with. It introduces you in a few different areas to this idea of what are the models and metaphors, and are there ones that are better than others. And so, as always, you're welcome to read the whole chapter if you want to, but I'm going to focus on three specific chapters. Specifically, on page 89, you have Robert Veitch's Models for Ethical Medicine in a Revolutionary Age. After that, we're going to look at page 95, From Loyalty to Advocacy, A New Metaphor in Nursing, from Gerald Winslow. And after that, we will take a look at page 105, Joan Callahan's Academic Paternalism. So we're going to look at this question of models and metaphors from the standpoint of doctors, nurses, and educators. All right, so if we start with Models for Ethical Medicine in a Revolutionary Age from Robert Veitch, Veitch explains that there are 4 different models that are in place in the profession of medicine. So we're talking in terms of doctors, surgeons, that aspect of medicine. And I've got these on the screen here for you. So let's put those up where hopefully you can read them. All right, there we go. So we have the engineering model, the priestly model, the collegial model, and the contractual model. Now, Veitch is going to argue that each one of these are options that are out there, and that you will find doctors that practice each of these types of medicine. The question becomes, are they all the same, or is one better than the other? And ultimately, what Veitch is going to argue is that the contractual model is better than the others. In the engineering model, the patient takes on all of the responsibility, makes all of the decisions. And so you think about a doctor who is kind of like a disinterested scientist. This person is going to, in fact, Veitch says, almost like a plumber. This is somebody that does exactly what you tell them, no more, no less. So you are the one, as the patient, who goes to that doctor, but you say, here's my problem, here's what I've got, this is what I need you to do for me. And that doctor is going to do it, no more, no less. You call the shots. It's kind of like if you call up a plumber and you say, hey, I've got a drain clog, come and unclog it. What's that plumber going to do? Well, they're going to come, they're going to do what you told them to do and unclog that drain, and then they're going to charge you a lot of money for doing so. Well, that's what the doctor in an engineering model doctor is going to do. They're going to do exactly what you told them to do, and then they're going to charge you a lot of money for doing so. But the doctor doesn't bear any of the responsibility because you're the one who calls the shots. The opposite of that is what you call the priestly model doctor. With the priestly model doctor, the doctor is the one who makes all the decisions, who holds all of the responsibility. The priestly model, these are the doctors who say, patients are idiots and therefore I'm not going to pay any attention to what they have to tell me. I'm the one who is going to make the decisions because I'm the one who has the knowledge. I know what's best for you, whether you do or not. Okay. If you guys remember Dr. House on television, that's a prime example of a priestly model doctor. Right? You the patient, are a moron. Why should I listen to anything you have to say? I'm going to call the shots because I know what's best. Now, both the engineering and the priestly model are options that are out there, but Veitch wants to argue very strongly against them because they don't meet certain criteria, which I'll talk about in just a moment. He goes on to say that there is also a collegial and a contractual model. With the collegial model, the doctor and the patient, they share the responsibility. They make the decisions together. They work together as colleagues. And he says that's good. That's a much better approach than having one side ride roughshod over the other. But the problem is that the doctor and the patient are not always colleagues, that they are people who are different in terms of their knowledge and understanding. They should work together, but they're not equals. They're not colleagues unless the patient happens to be a doctor too. If the patient's a doctor too, then yeah, the collegial model is great, but otherwise, probably not. And so that leaves us with what Veitch says should be the primary role or the primary model that's used by doctors, which is the contractual model. Under the contractual model, the doctor and the patient share their responsibilities. They share the rights. They make the decisions together. But it's a contract. And in entering that contract, the doctor has said that I am willing to listen to what you have had to say. I am willing to treat you with respect. I am willing to give you my knowledge and expertise. In exchange, I expect you to treat me with respect, to listen to what I have to say, to ask intelligent questions, to participate in this decision. So there are rights and responsibilities that go both directions. And the thing is, with a contract, if either side violates it, the contract itself becomes violated. The contract itself becomes broken. And so if the doctor feels that the patient is not living up to their side of the agreement, the doctor could say, I can't be your doctor anymore. You're going to need to go find a new doctor. Or the patient might say, you're not doing what I expect you to do. You're not treating me properly, etc. Therefore, I'm going to go find a new doctor. So with a contract, if either side violates it, the contract is broken, and either side is free to go about their business. So again, while all of those are viable options, it is the contractual model that Veitch wants to press. Now, why are the engineering and priestly models such a problem? Well, Veitch explains on page 90 that there are 5 basic criteria that any good model has to follow. First, producing good and not harm. As a doctor, you take an oath called a Hippocratic Oath. And under that Hippocratic Oath, the very first point is do no harm. Even before you try to make somebody better, even before you try to help somebody, the first point is to do no harm. Don't do anything that's going to make their condition worse. And so any policy that you put into effect has to be one that produces good and diminishes harm. But if one side is taking on all of the rights and responsibilities and the other side has no voice or say, it doesn't necessarily work towards the good. It could potentially produce harm. If you're following that engineering model and the doctor is holding no responsibility whatsoever, they're simply taking orders from the patient because the patient is the one who has the ailment, they're the ones who's paying the bills, they're the ones who hired me. If that's the basic idea that we're getting, then harm can come from that because that patient may not be able to know exactly what's wrong with them, may not know what the best treatment for their course of action is. The doctor needs to weigh in on this stuff. And so harm could come. And likewise, if you're following the priestly model, you would find that in that situation, with the doctor taking all the responsibility, maybe like Dr. House, I'm not going to bother to talk to the patient. I'm not going to worry about whether or not this patient is able to tell me anything relevant or not. I'm not maybe not even going to read the case histories. Why? Because the patient lies, because the patient's an idiot. But if you don't have that background information, then you might make a wrong diagnosis. your treatment might ultimately be wrong. So you can't do that. So that's why he says we really, really need to reject these priestly model doctors, these engineering model doctors. But the contractual and the collegial, since they both work towards the same goal, they are both working together, doctor and patient, towards producing good and not harm. Okay. The second and third point kind of go along well together, protecting individual freedom and preserving individual dignity. The idea is that any legitimate model that we use should recognize that both sides are autonomous human beings. They both have a sense of freedom to make their own choices and decisions. They are individuals who have a sense of dignity, a sense of humanity that must be respected. And so either any model that we put into effect has to be one where both the doctor and the patient are treated as autonomous human beings, are treated with respect and with dignity. And again, with one side riding roughshod over the other, as in the engineering or priestly model, that's not going to happen. But in the collegial and the contractual, it does. The fourth point, truth-telling and promise-keeping. Going kind of along with what we were saying before with the respecting the autonomy and the rights of the individuals involved, there has to be a sense in which that doctor is going to be open and honest with the patient, and in which the patient is going to be open and honest with the doctor. If we're going to work towards the good, we have to have honesty in order to see that happen. Now, later on in the course, we'll see that maybe there are some rare exceptions where honesty, complete honesty, may not be in the best interest of helping the patient. But generally speaking, the patient needs to be open and honest with all of their problems so that the doctor can diagnose correctly. And the doctor needs to be open and honest in general with the patient in order to make sure that they are doing what needs to be done. And finally, maintaining and restoring justice. We have to make sure that everyone who is involved is going to get the necessary treatment, that we can provide what is necessary for both sides. And again, he argues that the engineering model, the priestly model, fails to do this. The collegial and the contractual both will meet all 5 of those criteria, meaning that both of those are good models to use. The problem, again, is that for the collegial model, because you're seen as equals, the patient really has to also be a doctor. Otherwise, you're not equals, not in terms of your knowledge base. The patient may have tremendous knowledge, may not be a very bright individual in some area, but probably not in medicine. That patient may know a lot more in terms of engineering, perhaps, in terms of banking, in terms of economics. Maybe they know a lot more than the doctor does in that area, but the doctor knows generally more than the patient does in terms of medicine. That's why you're going to that doctor in the first place. So if the patient is, in fact, a doctor also medically trained, then yeah, collegial model is great. But otherwise, it's the contractual model, according to Veitch, that is best. Okay. So we're going to turn our attention now from doctors to nurses. And we'll take a look at page 95, From Loyalty to Advocacy, a New Metaphor in Nursing from Gerald Winslow. In that article, he's going to look at the nursing profession. Now, the nursing profession is different from that of doctors in general. As you saw, there were four major competing models within the role of the doctor. But for the nurse, there is really only one. But there's been a shift, there's been a change, and that's what he's talking about. We've gone from the original, what was called the military metaphor, to a new, what he calls an advocacy or a legal metaphor. And so we want to see that shift or that transition, and he's going to explain, why that took place, and ultimately that it is an improvement that nurses should be following this newer model as opposed to the old one. Now, why is it that nursing is different than doctoring? Ultimately, it has to do with history. The role of the doctor or the surgeon is almost as old as humanity itself. We've had doctors around for thousands and thousands of years. We have evidence from 9,000 years ago of brain surgery taking place, people doing forms of trepanning and things like that. So doctors have been around for a very long time. Nursing is a much more recent profession, and it really only comes into its own in the 19th century. And it happens because of the advancements that are taking place in military matters. By the time we get to the Crimean War of the 1850s, the American Civil War of the 1860s, our technologies had advanced to such an extent that we could kill, wound, maim people on a much larger scale than we ever could before. Just to put it into perspective, if you look at the entire 8 years of the American Revolutionary War, there are about 25,000 casualties. That's the same number of casualties as we had in 3 days of fighting at the Battle of Gettysburg during the American Civil War. 8 years as opposed to 3 days. That's what our advancements in technology and techniques have done. And so by the time that you get there, doctors simply can't cope anymore. Throughout most of our history, your town doctor, your naval surgeon, your army surgeon, they could handle what was necessary. But by the time you get to the 1850s, 1860s, the Crimean War, the American Civil War, and everything that came after it, the casualty lists were so great that they just simply couldn't cope anymore. The doctors didn't have enough hands, they didn't have enough time. And so a new profession really was brought into existence, and that is the profession of nursing. Now, there were some nurses prior to this, but it wasn't a major profession until this point. Now, thing is that in the beginning, there really were no nursing training schools or anything like that. So most of the people who came out to the battlefields to help were housewives, people from the village, people from the towns, wives who were traveling with their husbands in the military. These were the people who became most of the first nurses, and they had no training, no skill whatsoever. And so what did they do? Well, they listened to what the doctor told them. The doctor says, do this, and they did it. And that's where the first metaphor in nursing comes into play, what we call the military metaphor. It's called the military metaphor because obviously nursing really began during a time of war. And if you think about it, a lot of the terminology that we use in nursing is still there. A nurse wears a uniform while on duty, just like a soldier would. A nurse has to be willing to endure many, many hours of standing, of walking, just like a soldier would. That's the word I'm looking for. Just like a soldier would. Just like a soldier has to follow the orders of their commanding officer. The nurse is going to do the same thing. Their duty is to obey the orders of the doctor. The doctor is the commanding officer. The nurse is the subordinate officer. And so we see a lot of that military discipline coming into the field of nursing very early on. Now, in the beginning, of course, this makes sense because, as I said, there really weren't very many nurses who had any type of training. I mean, you had a few Florence Nightingales and Clara Bartons and Dorothea Dixes. You had a few people like that who had some medical knowledge, but the vast majority were just people coming in to help and do what they could. And so they needed instruction. They needed on-the-job training, so to speak, but in a time of war with so many casualties, this is hard to get. And so the nurse becomes, in many ways, somebody who simply holds the hand of someone, brings them some water, helps them write a letter. They're doing things of this nature, but they do what the doctor tells them to do. And like that subordinate officer, they should follow the doctor's orders absolutely and without question, because the doctor's the one who has the medical training. They're the one who has the knowledge, not the nurse. So right from the beginning, the duty of the nurse was to obey the doctor. All right, so under the military, There it is. Under the military metaphor, the duty is to obey the orders of the doctor and to protect the doctor. The nurse had no type of independent accountability. The nurse had no direct knowledge to be able to do anything on their own. They simply had to obey and follow the orders that are given by the doctor. That's the basic idea behind the military metaphor. As time went by, as we get out of the Civil War and we enter into the 1870s, we start to get nursing schools being established. And at that point, the nurses do receive some training, they do receive knowledge, and they increasingly become more knowledgeable as time goes by. But the metaphor doesn't change. The idea that you are still the subordinate officer, that your duty is to protect the doctor, to obey the doctor without question, remains. All of the nursing textbooks of this era have this to where it's drilled into the heads of the nurses. Obey, obey, obey. Don't challenge, don't question, obey. That's the primary concept that's being taught to the nurses in these early nursing schools, in these early textbooks. Well, again, it kind of makes sense because medicine in the 19th century is still relatively primitive. There's things that we can do to ease the pain of someone, but there wasn't a whole lot in terms of what we could do to really cure or help an individual. What was most important for a person to get well was their mental state. A person had to firmly believe in the medicine, had to believe in the doctor in order for it to for the medicine to work. This is something actually that's still true today. You can take somebody with an ailment and you can pump them all full of as much drugs as you want to, but if that person has mentally made up their mind that they're not going to get better, they're probably not, because their mind is working against their body. And on the other hand, if you have those people who have this positive outlook on life, that person keeps pushing, I'm going to get better, I'm going to get better, and their mind is working towards that because they believe in what their doctor's doing, that person has a much better chance of getting better than somebody who doesn't have that mindset. So our mind is a very powerful tool, and it's very important in the well-being of medicine in general. And so at this time, that was primarily what you had. You had that capacity, you had that ability to make someone believe in the medicine. Now, of course, sometimes things go wrong, maybe through mistakes, maybe through natural means. The important thing was that the patient should not be allowed to lose faith in the doctor or the medicine. So when something went wrong, that meant somebody had to take the blame for it. It would be the nurse. And that's what it means when it says to protect the doctor. If the doctor makes a mistake, the doctor shouldn't be called out on it. The nurse should take the responsibility. The nurse should take the blame for it, so that the patient doesn't lose faith in the doctor. And that, again, was the way that medicine worked in the 19th century, even into the early 20th century. And so this idea continues, even though the nurses gain greater and greater knowledge as time goes by, even though advancements are made in medicine, the old military metaphor still remains. But this is going to start to make a shift towards the 1920s, 1930s. And specifically, there is one case which is talked about in your book on page, I think it's 99. And this is one that's very famous. Those of you who are in nursing schools might have heard of this already. It's called the Sumera Case. But this is what really begins to make that transition. It's what begins to make that change. Okay. Let me see if I can find it here. All right. In 1929 in Manila, a newly graduated nurse, Lorenza Sumero, was found guilty of manslaughter, sentenced to a year in prison, and fined 1,000 pesos because she followed a physician's order. The physician had mistakenly called for the preparation of cocaine injections when he meant procaine for a tonsillectomy patient. Witnesses agreed that the physician ordered the cocaine, that Sumera verified the order, and that the physician administered the injections. But the physician was acquitted and Sumera was found guilty because she failed to question the orders. The Supreme Court upheld the lower court's decision. Nurses around the world, and especially in the United States, were at first stunned and then incensed. A successful protest campaign was organized, and Sumera was pardoned before serving a day of her sentence. But the whole affair left an enduring impression on nurses. The doctrine of respondeat superior turned out to be thin security. Never again could nurses be taught simply to follow doctors' orders. So here is Sumera, this newly graduated nurse. She's gone through medical school and had drilled into her head this idea of obey, obey, obey. Never question, never challenge, obey. And so this doctor, who maybe is, running thin, maybe he's at the end of a very long shift, whatever, but he makes a simple slip of the tongue, a simple mistake. And he says, I want a cocaine injection as opposed to a procaine. It's only a couple letters difference. Big difference in terms of potency, but in terms of letters, only a minor slip. The nurse verifies the order, fixes the injection. The doctor's the one who gives the injection, but yet the doctor walks away scot-free, and Sumera is the one who's brought up on charges and found guilty in this court. Because why? Because she didn't question him? Because she didn't challenge him? That's not her job, right? Her job, according to everything that she's been taught in nursing school, is to never question or challenge, but always to obey. And that's exactly what she did. Well, again, this set to mind to a lot of people what was wrong with the system and why it is that nurses shouldn't be seen just as subordinate officers who had to obey, that doctors did sometimes make mistakes, and that maybe we needed someone who could look out for the interests of the patient rather than just looking out for the interests of the doctor. So that's what the nurse started advocating for, this idea that we need to change our metaphor from a military metaphor to what we call a legal or an advocacy metaphor. And that's the one that, starting in the 1930s after the Sumera case, that's the one we started moving towards, is what we now call the legal or the advocacy metaphor, where the idea is to protect the patient, even if that means protecting them from the doctor. That your duty, first and foremost, was to advocate for or look out for the interests of the patient. Your duty was no longer to the doctor, but to the patient. But even though it starts in the 1930s, this movement, it's going to take over 50 years before it really begins to cement itself into the way of doing things. Why? Well, because there's always opposition from within. A lot of doctors during this time period were those priestly model doctors, and they felt that it was their obligation to look out for everyone's interests. They were used to being in charge. They didn't like to be questioned or challenged in any way, and so they wouldn't put up with it. Nurses who began challenging or questioning the doctor, even though they were now being taught that this is what they're supposed to do, those people were finding themselves being disciplined. They were finding themselves being punished for doing so. And so it's going to take a long time before minds can be changed. We notice here that there's a trail that we can follow in the nursing codes of ethics, where we see these transitions and changes taking place. So when we started getting the nursing codes of ethics, it says things like this. Loyalty to the motive which inspires nursing should make the nurse fearless to bring to light any serious violation of the ideals herein expressed. In 1940, the American Nursing Association called for nurses to verify and carry out the physician's orders. to sustain confidence in the physician and report incompetency or unethical conduct only to the proper authority. 1953's code spelled out the nurse's obligation to follow the physician's orders loyally and to maintain confidence in the physician. So you can see that here we are 20, 30 years after the time of Sumera, and yet this idea of obeying the doctor is still there. This idea of looking out for the doctor's interests is still there. It's going to be the 1970s before the real idea of advocacy starts to really make its way, 50 years after Sumera, before this idea really starts to make its way in. During the 1970s, the concept of advocacy is incorporated into the Nursing Code of Ethics. The 1973 revision of the International Council of Nurses Code dropped all mention of loyal obedience to the physician's orders. Instead, the code said that the nurse's primary responsibility is to those people who require nursing care. So now, in 1973, we're starting to get this idea that maybe you should be looking out for the patient. The 1976 revision of the ANA codes requires nurses to protect the client from the incompetent, unethical, or illegal practices of any person. So it takes until 1976 before it's actually placed into the code of nursing that you are to protect the patient, even if that means protecting them from the doctor. That's the point where nurses really, 50 years after Sumera, that's the time when nurses really take on this idea of independent accountability. And of course, it makes sense because now nurses are very highly trained individuals. People who have gone through a lot of schooling, a lot of training, a lot of residency before they get into that position. There are nurse practitioners which are practically doctors themselves. They can write prescriptions in their own right and so on. So it makes sense that nurses should have greater responsibility and greater accountability in their own right. They should not just be seen as handholders anymore. They shouldn't just be seen as subordinate officers obeying orders. The nurse needs to take on that responsibility that is given to us under the legal or advocacy metaphor, which is, what has been in effect since the 70s. But of course, it's still taken time to get us to that point. It's still taken time because you have to fight old prejudices, you have to fight old ideas, you have to make sure that, the doctors and the nurses are all on board with this new way of thinking, this new idea. And it was hard going. In the beginning, nurses had to really kind of play around to protect themselves. For example, if you were to take what happened with the Sumera case, the doctor, again, ordered cocaine rather than procaine for this tonsillectomy patient. Now, the nurse maybe, instead of coming right out and challenging the doctor, which could have potentially gotten her into trouble, maybe what she would have done would have been to say, that's interesting because I had always thought that we used procaine for tonsillectomy. You're calling for cocaine. Is there some new treatment that I've not heard about yet? Make it seem like you're trying to learn from the doctor, pander to their ego, right? And when you do that, it's protecting yourself because you're not coming right out and challenging the doctor. You are, because you're giving that person the opportunity to stop and think and say, well, wait a minute, what did I say? And to correct their mistake. But at the same time, you're not doing it in a challenging sort of way. You're pandering to the ego of the doctor. You're acknowledging that, hey, this doctor, which quite honestly, the doctor is supposed to continue to read all the medical journals and keep up with the new techniques. So who knows, maybe there is some new technique that he was going by. Maybe cocaine is the thing that was going to be used instead of procaine. Maybe he really meant to say that. But here's your opportunity to find out, right? So maybe it is really a way of gaining new knowledge. But the point is that, in the beginning especially, you couldn't just challenge the doctor outright. You had to play around in that way. You had to play those kinds of games. But the nurse had to start taking on that type of responsibility. Otherwise, they may find themselves in a situation just like Sumera was, even as late as the 1970s. But in the 40 some odd years since 1976, we've moved closer and closer to that idea of the legal or advocacy metaphor. We've gotten closer to that idea that the nurse is a genuine medical professional, someone who is knowledgeable, someone who is skilled, someone who is there to help you. But at the end of Winslow's article, he lists several things that he says if we really want to cement this legal metaphor in place, and that is something that we're going to want to do, he says what we need to do is to make these changes, incorporate these ideas. And so we'll take a look at these around page 102, 103. 1, the meaning of advocacy needs to be clarified. A lot of times when people hear the word advocate, they automatically think of troublemakers. Right? Advocates are those people who chain themselves to trees. Advocates are the people that stand in front of town hall causing trouble and congestion. We think of advocates as being troublemakers. But the fact is that an advocate, by definition, is simply someone who advocates for someone else, someone who looks out for the interests of another. And so shouldn't it make sense that as a patient, someone who is put into a hospital, a somewhat scary and unfamiliar environment, wouldn't you want someone to advocate for you, for your interests, who knows the ins and outs of that place, someone for whom that place is not unknown or intimidating? It makes sense that you'd want that person to advocate on your behalf. And let's face it, if you've ever been to a hospital, you know that it's the nurse that you're interacting with. The doctor might come in once a day, look at a chart, grunt incoherently, and walk out. But the nurse is the one who's going to talk to you, who's going to explain things, who's going to answer questions for you, and so on. So it makes sense that the nurse should act as an advocate. But we need to make sure that people understand what we mean by that terminology, advocate, so that they understand that advocate doesn't mean you're a troublemaker. It means you're somebody who is looking out for the best interest of the patient. Secondly, the State's Nurse Practice Act needs revision. It needs to be put right into the nursing codes what exactly a nurse can do and what a nurse can't do. It needs to be made very precise and very clear so that we don't have any gray areas left. Once that takes place, then, he says we'd be in a good shape. Thirdly, patients or their families are often unprepared to accept the nurse as advocate. We need a little bit of re-education. A lot of times, people still think upon the nurse as the subordinate officer. A lot of times, people still think of the nurse as a handholder. And so we need to re-educate the population so that they understand that the nurse is a highly trained medical professional, someone who has your best interests at heart, someone who is able to advocate for you. So we need that re-education. The fourth point, advocacy is frequently associated with controversy. That really goes back to point one. It's part of the re-education process. Advocates are not necessarily troublemakers. Advocates should be looking out for the best interest of the individual. And finally, fifthly, as an advocate, the nurse is bound to be torn at times by conflicting interests and loyalties. As a nurse, you may have to sometimes do things that you don't agree with or things that you don't necessarily think are right. And so part of the training has to be on the part of the nurses. I mean, nurses by nature they go into that profession because they're caring individuals. But a nurse, like a doctor, has to have an element of detachment. A doctor has to have more detachment than a nurse does, but it's something important that has to be taught so that a person can do their job effectively. Certainly if you care about your patients, which you should, then it is going to affect you if one of your patients doesn't make it. but you can't allow it to affect you so much that you're unable to do anything for the remaining patients who need you. And so you need that element of detachment, and that's something that has to be taught as well. But Winslow says that if we were to incorporate those 5 ideas, that we would be able to very nicely cement the legal metaphor in place in nursing. And I think that we've done a very, very good job of that over the last 40 some odd years. It does seem that we are at that point where the legal metaphor is firmly cemented and where most people do recognize the nurse as a trained medical professional who is looking out for your well-being, who is looking out for your interests. The final article that I wanted to look at in this section is at page 105, and that's Joan Callahan's Academic Paternalism. We've talked about the idea of models within medicine, doctors and nurses. Callahan wants to look at it from the standpoint of education. And so she looks at 3 different relationships. The relationship between the student and the instructor, between the student and the academic department, and between the student and the university as a whole. And in each of these cases, she says that many people will argue that what's in place in academia is a paternalistic model. We learned last time, remember, the paternalism is that idea that I, as the parent, know better than you, as the child, what is in your best interest. So I'm going to impose my will upon you. Carrying it over to the professional world, I, as the professional, know better than you what is in your best interest as the client. So as the professional, I will impose my will upon you as the client. I will force you against your will, but I'm doing it because I believe that it's in your best interest. So many people will argue, she says, that the metaphor that's used in academia is one that's paternalistic, but it's not. She says it is not a paternalistic model at all. It is a contractual model. And there's one major reason where we can see this, and that is that in that relationship between the parent and the child, the parent forces or imposes their will upon the child. The child doesn't like it, but at least until they reach a certain age, there's not much of anything they can do about it. They have to live with it. They have to accept it. But in the academic relationship, if that instructor or that department or that university imposes things upon the student that they don't like and they don't want to do, they don't have to. They've entered into a contract to say, I'm willing to do these things because I want to get this result. But in actuality, if you say, I don't want to do this, you have the right to walk away. You can drop the class, you can change your major, you can change your university, or drop out altogether. You have those options that are available to you that are not available to you as the child. When that parent says to the child, you've got to eat all of that spinach, and the child doesn't want to, there's not a whole lot the child can do about it. But when the instructor says, you've got to do this, and the student says, I don't want to, well, you know, the instructor can't force the student to do it. They can choose not to and take a bad grade, or they can drop the class, or, you know, whatever they want to do. They have the freedom to do that because it's not paternalism. It is a contract. Callahan, when looking at the relationship between the instructor and the student, she uses the example of a golf pro. So let's imagine that you want to improve your golf game. And so you hire this golf pro to train you, to teach you. Well, it's going to seem on the surface like they're imposing their will upon you. But you have to remember that you've gone to that person and you've said, this is what I want you to do. You've entered into a contract and you've said, I'm willing to pay you X amount of money in exchange for you helping me to improve my golf game. So when that golf pro looks at your stance and says, okay, well, you can't stand stiff and rigid like that. You've got to loosen up a little bit. Look, you're holding the club wrong. You've got to hold it in this way. They are, in a sense, it seems like imposing their will upon you, but yet they're doing exactly what you told them to do. That child never asked the parent to force them to eat spinach. The student asked the golf pro to teach them to play better golf. And so they've entered into it voluntarily. Now, if that student says, well, I don't really like to grip the club that way. I prefer to do it my own way, and I like to stand stiff and rigid when I play. That student has every right to do that. But they also really shouldn't bother paying this instructor if they're not going to listen to the instructor's advice. You can go on playing the way you always have, and you're more than welcome to do that. But what's the point of paying that golf pro if you're not going to get any benefit from it? Doesn't make sense to do it. So you entered that contract freely. If you decide you don't want to take the advice of that golf pro, you have the right to leave it as well. You enter the contract freely, you can leave the contract freely. So if you feel that you're not getting what you're expecting from that golf pro, you have the ability to leave. If the golf pro feels that you're not doing what you should be doing in order to work and improve your game, maybe they might say, hey, I don't think it's working anymore. Maybe you should try something else or go somewhere else. Maybe golf isn't your game after all, whatever. But the point is that it's not paternalism. It's not forcing you against your will in the way that a paternalistic model would. And the same thing if you look at an academic class. If I were to say, hey, I need everybody to write a 20-page paper this weekend, and you had other plans and didn't like this being sprung upon you in that way, you have every right to say, well, I'm not going to do it. And if you don't do it, well, you're either going to get a 0 for that score and we carry on, or you're going to say, oh, well, I'm going to drop the class because it's too much work. But why am I doing that? Well, it's because, in that case, it would be an assignment that is necessary, or I feel is necessary for the class for you to be able to advance. But at the same time, you still entered the class voluntarily. You have the right to leave it voluntarily. So that's contract. It's not paternalism. And the same thing would apply when you look at the relationship between the university department and the student. When you go to declare a major in any academic department, you're going to be given a list of requirements. These are the classes that you have to take if you want to get that degree. And again, some people might look at that and say, well, that's paternalism. You're forcing me against my will. But no. Callahan says no. You chose that particular career field. And what the department is doing is justifying itself, its own existence. In order to graduate you with a particular degree, there's a certain type of knowledge that you're going to need. And if you lack that, then people are not going to hire you. And if it gets out that people from this department are leaving school without the knowledge that they need, they're not getting hired, nobody's going to come to that department for education. And the whole department ends up closing. It ends up going under. I mean, imagine what would happen if you went in to declare a pre-med major and you said, hey, I want to declare a pre-med major, but I don't want to have to take any of those nasty biology classes. Ugh, don't like those things. Well, how could we allow you to graduate with a medical degree if you've never taken biology? Can't do it, right? The school would become a laughingstock if you did that. Nobody would hire you if you did that. You wouldn't be able to go on to graduate school if you did that, right? So in a sense, it is in your interest, but you're the one who chose that particular career field. And you have the choice to say, well, I don't want to do that then. And you can take some other discipline, go declare some other major where you don't have to take a biology class. And between the university and the student as well. When you go to the university, there's a code of conduct that you have to agree to follow. Maybe there's a residency requirement that you have to make. So in those instances, again, it seems like they're imposing their will upon you, but in reality, they're not, because you're the one who chose to go to that university. And if you don't like or can't agree with the rules that you're being asked to follow, which the university has every right to make, then you have the right to say, well, I'm going to go to a different university, or I'm not going to bother with schooling altogether. You have that freedom. And the point is that in the academic world, you do not have a paternalistic model. It is not life with mother and father, as Callahan puts it. Instead, it is simply a matter of entering into a contract. And so when you enter into a contract, there's rights and responsibilities on both sides, just like we saw with Veitch's model. The doctor and the patient, right? Both had rights and responsibilities, and both sides had to live up to it, or else the contract would be broken. Well, the same thing applies in the academic world. Both sides have to agree. Both sides have to live up to that agreement. If either side violates it, the contract is broken. If you don't live up to your agreement with the school, that school may choose to expel you. Or if you feel the school is not living up to your expectations and meeting your their side of the bargain, then you have the right to walk away from it and do something else. So it is purely a contractual model. So this is basically it as far as Chapter 4 is concerned. It's this idea, again, that in every profession we go into, there are certain models that we're expected to follow. Again, some of them, like in medicine, there's many, and you have to kind of figure out which one is the best to follow. In others, like in nursing or here in academia, there's one model that's going to be put into effect. Maybe there'll be a paradigm shift that takes place like there was in nursing, but ultimately it's one model that's going to be followed. And that's what you're going to find in any profession that you go into. Now, the case study that goes along with this chapter on page 120, Police and Paternalism, which we'll be getting to shortly. The idea there is to look at the role of the police officer. Should a police officer act under a paternalistic model? Is it their job to impose their will upon you, believing that it's in your best interest to do so? Or is there another model that they should follow? Should the police officer follow a model perhaps of autonomy, to say that each individual is their own person and it's my duty to protect the rights and the interests of that individual? So what is the model that a police officer should follow? Should they be a paternalistic figure? Should they be one who respects the autonomy of the individual? Is there some other model? But that's what we need to figure out in that case study. So those of you who are working with case 2, I look forward to hearing what you have to say about that. All right, but that'll do it for today. If anybody has any questions or concerns, of course, as always, feel free to email me, and we'll be happy to answer those for you. But otherwise, have a great day.